Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's demonstration. Last class, we threw all these vessels, right? We had an introduction of throwing on the potter's wheel, and we did some faceting. We did some throwing and altered kind of pieces. We did some pieces that were thrown off the hump. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to finish them. We're going to trim them. It's so important to be aware of how your clay is drying and to control that moisture level. And so over the last 2 days, as soon as I felt this rim start to get to that stage called leather hard, I would take it and then I would flip this over. And what this does is it creates like a chance for your vessel to dry a little bit more evenly. If I just left it up like this rim is going to dry out before the bottom, and most likely it's going to crack, and it's going to create some more difficulties once I put it back on the wheel and I try to trim it up. All right, so now I have all these vessels, and I'm going to bring them back over to the potter's wheel, and I'm going to get my trimming tools, right? And so we're going to trim up all of these 6 or 7 vessels that we made this last class. And we're going to put a foot on them. And a foot does a few different things, right? It creates a nice, stable base. So the pot's not like a wobbler or something. It takes off a lot of the weight, so it feels a little bit better in your hand. It also takes off that extra weight to accentuate the form a little bit, right? There's so many different ways to be able to trim a foot on the bottom of your piece. And if you're like a really good potter, you don't necessarily even have to trim, right? You could do all of it during the wet stage. And a lot of potters that are like production potters, they try to skip out as many stages as they can. So they actually will figure out how to make their piece really, really thin. And when they cut it off, it's already finished and they can just let it dry. But the majority of us like to spend some time and come back on the potter's wheel and trim the foot to accentuate the form a little bit. So first off, I need a little bit of clay. Can I borrow some of your clay? So first thing is I got to get it centered, right? And so obviously you can see how that's dancing. It's off center. I want to kick it into center. An easy way to do that is if I keep my hand really steady, you can see where it's touching right there. Just right there, it's touching. That means this pot is too far this way. So I'm going to push it the opposite direction. And so I'm going to do it one more time. Hits right there. I'm going to kind of push it in. I'm going to come back. You can see how it's a little bit closer to be centered. Kick it just a little bit more, and that looks good to me. So now what I want to do is I want to lug it down. And lugs are these locking coils to keep the pot on the wheel as it's spinning. Much like how lugs hold your wheel on your car, it's the same kind of idea. And I usually use 3 to 5 lugs depending on the size of the piece. And I just kind of lock it in by pushing that coil around the outside. And so that's kind of on there. We have 2 different types of trimming tools. This is a pear-shaped trimming tool. This is like one of the most common tools that are around. A lot of potters can trim any form just with this because it has that nice rounded voluptuous fat side. It has a completely flat side and then that little kind of detailed area. If you look at some of the advanced students, they have like hundreds of different types of trimming tools and they all have different shapes at the end. And there's some potters that actually make their own depending on what they're kind of trimming and what they're using. Different cultures have different types of trimming tools too, which is really interesting. So the first thing is that I always practice keeping a finger right on the top. And a good way to remember doing that is that you could just take a little bit of clay and make a little bit of a divot. And what that is that I'm pushing down from the top. So as I'm putting pressure on the side, my vessel's not going to fall over or kick off center. It's not that big of a deal on like a really big, wide, shallow form, like a bowl. But if I have like a cylinder that's really, really tall, it's important that you kind of put a little bit of pressure down. So when you're putting pressure on the outside, it doesn't tip over and the lugs get loose. All right, so what I want to do is I want to accentuate this form. And there's so many different ways to be able to finish the foot on there to be able to accentuate it. You know, I could create like a pedestal foot. I could have a really small, shallow foot. I could have a flat, squared foot. I could have a round, voluptuous foot. And so the ticket is that usually you want to mimic some of the elements that are on the vessel itself. And so if I have like a flat edged wide piece, I might want to have a flat kind of foot on it. If I'm going to have a bowl, maybe I want more of a rounded kind of foot on it. It's completely up to you. What I want to do is I just want to kind of hold my tool. I'm going to brace myself, my fingers in the middle, and notice how just like when you're throwing, your hands should always be connected. It's so important. All right, so I'm going to hold on to this. I'm going to hold this nice and steady, and I'm just going to, first off, take this corner, and I'm just going to push it in until it just starts to hit, and I start to define where my center is as that's starting to spin. And you can see just a little bit, I'm starting to define that foot that's on there. I'm going to then make the top level by finding that corner and just kind of pushing in a little bit right there. And so what's really interesting is you could see how I took a lot of clay there, but I barely took any clay here. So I'm holding my tool really steady as I bring it in, and it's cutting off anything that's uneven to make it even. And I could just follow that line right in. And so now I know that this is flat and that's relatively flat. The next thing is I could start to define where my inside donut's going to be, and so I could just make a little bit of a mark. And I usually have the foot the same thickness as the thickness of the vessel. So if it's a really big platter, you might want to have a little bit thicker foot. If it's a really thin, small teapot, you might want to have a thinner foot that's on there. And so now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to start to take away a little bit of this clay, a little bit of it at a time. It's almost like working on a lathe on a wheel, or on a lathe with a piece of wood, if anybody's done that. And I let the wheel do the work. I just hold this steady and it'll start to take away some of that excess clay. I'm going to then dig in underneath just a little bit, and I can define my foot right there. Technically, that's all you have to trim, is like the bottom quarter of the piece or so. I didn't do very much. And so from here down was all finished when I was working on the potter's wheel, right? But if you want to, you have an opportunity to trim a little bit more if you want to. And if since this is kind of a voluptuous form, I'm going to change the shape of this now and just kind of round this out. And you can see how it's changing that element, just barely taking off any of that clay. I'm accentuating the vessel a little bit differently. Some people like to use this big pear-shaped tool to do the big part of the wall. And so I could hold this in there and maybe I could take off a little bit more of this weight, take off some of those throw lines. And I'm kind of just like working that transition up and over. So that's already looking like a pretty decent foot. I'm going to take a little bit more of this weight out of here. It's really important before I put the vessel down, like I felt it a little bit, right? And I felt like, okay, this is all really thin here, but it's a little bit thicker on here. And I kind of mentally have an idea about how much weight that I could take off. When you're first starting, you might go through the bottom, but that's just going to teach you a little bit about, kind of gauging how thick or thin this wall is. One way is I go back and I burnish, and if I ever feel that foot start to, the bottom go in a little bit, I know that I'm thin enough. I'm going to take a little bit more of this off. I'm going to just burnish that. And so then that's the last thing, is I take my finger and I just hold it on there, and I'm feeling for anything that's offensive. I'm kicking in any of those big chunks of sand and grog, and I'm trying to burnish or smooth out that edge. So if it's ever slid across the table, it's not going to scratch your mom's or grandmother's 300-year-old antique mahogany table, right? It's really smooth. So then you could roll up these lugs and you can kind of see that vessel and how it looks, right? So we could hand this around and you could see the last thing is I'm going to put my name on it and I'm going to claim it as my own. Okay, fantastic. Let's go ahead and do another one. This one I'm going to change and I'll do a little bit differently, and then you'll be able to see the difference. Right off the bat, I'm pretty close to getting it centered. And so right about there, that feels good to me. Nothing is ever perfectly in center, right? You just get it close to where that center axis is. I'm gonna roll this around, put on my lugs, get this wheel going. Oh, somehow that got a little bit off center. So right there it's touching. I'm gonna push it over just a little bit, relock that down. And so that feels a little bit better to me. So I'm gonna hold this nice and steady. I could find that spot to put my finger. Now I'm gonna start to take away some of this excess clay. This one I'm gonna put more of a pedestal foot on it. I'm gonna make the bottom level now. And so I'm just gonna kind of go in there. And you can see again how like I'm barely taking any from this side, but I'm taking a whole bunch from that side. And I'm gonna continue to push that line in. This foot already is a little bit wider than the other one. It's gonna be accentuated a little bit differently. I always take that transition from the wall up into the bottom of the foot. And there's usually a spot right here between the foot and the base of the vessel, and that's called the glaze catch. And so that little bit of a line that's there is that when that glaze becomes molten and it starts to become fluid, there's that viscosity to that molten glass. And as it's starting to move with gravity, it catches on that little transition between the two and it holds up so the glaze doesn't go off the foot and onto the shelf. Let's go ahead and start to take off some of this weight in here. Notice how I'm always holding the pot. Notice how my fingers are always together to create a little bit more stability one way or the other. Now I'm going to bring in a little bit more of this. Suck this under just a tad bit, and I'm really going to accentuate more of a pedestal kind of foot on here. Switch over to another tool if you need to. And I'm touching the pot. I'm making sure that it's nice and smooth and burnished. I'm rounding off that edge a little bit. Take off a little bit more of this clay just to accentuate that bottom. Okay. Slow it down, roll up my lugs, and then you can see how that's completely a different kind of view. Very similar vessel on the top, but completely different on the bottom, right? Does this look more elegant? Does this like look more traditional? Does this have a different comfort? Maybe this is more of like you would drink something fancier out of it than this one. Okay, easy peasy. So this pot we faceted the outside and then we pinched the edge. And so this is called thrown and altered. Same kind of idea. I'm gonna feel it and I know that the bottom's a little bit thin. I got some weight over on this edge. Now I'm gonna get it as close to center as I can. So right there, it looks pretty good to me. I'm gonna take those coils, lock it back in, and then I'm gonna start to trim. So I'm gonna get that bottom level. It already is level. I'm gonna start to work this edge here. This one, maybe I won't put like a big traditional foot on it. Maybe I'll just have like an indentation. And the more that I take in that foot, the more it's gonna accentuate the voluptuous of the vessel. And so then I could take my needle tool or a sharp edge, and some people like to just put a little bit of a line, and that's your glaze catch. And that's where you glaze too. And so when you wipe it with your sponge at the end or you apply your wax resist, you go to that foot, you go to that line. But I'm going to take it off. And then let's look at it. Here we go. Keep them coming, one at a time. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Thanks. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to define where I want my foot. Let's say it's right here, somewhere in there. I'm then going to go ahead and put my slip on there, right? Instead of slip, I'm just adding a little bit of water, and then I'm going to score it a couple times. And this is making sure that the water can get into all those cracks. And I can come back and I can do my hash marks. Slipping and scoring is so important when you start to combine different pieces. I'm going to roll out some extra clay. And then I'm going to put this on here so I can start to make my own foot. I could work this in. And then I could use my sponge. And I'm going to throw now a foot on the bottom. And so then now you can see that foot that's on there. Isn't that kind of interesting, right? Once that dries, I could put some handles on it. I could build up some more of those elements that are on there. We have two more to do that we threw from our demos last week. This is more of a vase. And this one, I was thinking I can maybe do this technique called chattering for you, which is really interesting. All right, so chattering is a type of trimming, and this is a tool that I made from some banding. There was this heavy equipment that was delivered over in maintenance, and it was wrapped in this metal banding and clipped together to hold it in place. And so I cut little pieces of it, and I took it outside, and I just ground down an edge so it's a little bit sharp, and then I bent over the edge. And the idea is that it's kind of trimming, but it has an angle that's offensive to the surface of the clay. So when it catches, it actually bounces just a little bit, and it starts to bounce or chatter really, really quick as this is going around. It's important that your pot is locked in there very, very tight. And this is one of the only techniques that you put the wheel on really, really fast. You can start from the top and go to the bottom, or you could start at the bottom and go to the top. And so I'm going to get in there. I'm going to start to trim. And so you can start to see how it creates like a different kind of texture on the outside of your vessel. That's called chattering. Okay, so this is the last one that we made. This was a plate, and then we did a thrown and altered rim on it. We did some accents, which is I did my daughter's initials. I don't know if you could tell that I did that, but then it creates a little bit more interest to me. So think about like putting in some of those marks that are, you know, can represent you in your life and what's important to you. but you can see how the foot accentuates the vessel. You have all these trimmings that are left over, which is a material. And so when you're thinking about being like a sculptor, as an artist, like one thing to be conscious of is like the material that's around you. And the majority of all potters that get this just throw it back into the recycle bin. This is just waste to them, right? When I was in grad school, though, I was in Southern California, and I'm from Minnesota, and so I started missing my home. And at the end, I started digging this stuff out, and I started to just like sculpt these really cool birds' nests, and you can make them really, really quick, just like that. That one's done. And then I would start to make these little eggs for them. These things sell like hotcakes. And you'll see them in all the galleries in Bisbee, right? And so right there, that's, I don't know, $30 that I just made. Money, right? That's money. You got to think about money, is what I'm talking about, right? And so there we go. There's a bird's nest made out of scraps. And so sometimes you make some of the best work out of the leftover pieces. And the reason being is that you're so conscious to make something so beautiful that's intentional, right? And your focus is into it almost like a meditation, right? And there's this need to control the material to have it be exactly how you want. And so when you're making something, you have scraps that are left aside. When those scraps come into play, it allows you to like a little bit more freedom to just play. And so I always recommend, if you're working on like some slab pieces or a sculptural piece, whatever's left over, try to quickly put that together into something else. And often you'll be surprised with the spontaneity that's involved with some of those leftover pieces of like the statement or the concept of what you can make. Most people throw that stuff away, but now it's like one of the most important elements that come from these beautiful vessels that we make, right? Okay, easy peasy. Let's go make some money. Do it to it. Okay, have a great day.